Dog saw her first. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward, when the reviews were written and the meetings were held and the apologies were issued. Everyone focused on what Kowalski said, or what the administrator failed to do, or what the policy should have been. Nobody mentioned that the dog, a Belgian Malinois named Sable, black-tipped and barrel-chested and wound tight as a coil spring, had stopped growling the moment Nadine walked into room 14. Just stopped, mid-snarl, and watched her. The veteran in the bed noticed. He always noticed everything. Nadine Fournier had been a registered nurse at Riverton General for 6 years, which was long enough to know which vending machine on the 3rd floor actually gave you your change back, and short enough that she still felt something when a shift went badly. She was 31 years old, 5'4", and had a habit of tucking her ID badge into her breast pocket so the lanyard didn't catch on equipment. A small thing, but it had saved her twice during codes. She was the kind of person who remembered details like that. It was, her charge nurse Paulette always said, both her greatest strength and the reason she was going to burn out before 40. She came on shift at 1900 hours on a Tuesday in February, and the first thing she heard was the dog, not barking. That almost would have been easier. It was a low, sustained sound, something between a growl and a warning, the kind of vocalization that said, "I have been patient, but my patience has a floor." It was coming from the far end of the behavioral health corridor, room 14, and it had apparently been going on with short breaks for the better part of 3 hours. Paulette met her at the nursing station with a look that meant your problem now. Room 14. Warrant Officer 2nd Class Daniel Fehr, Canadian Army, retired. Admitted this afternoon through emergeta acute PTSD episode, possible TBI secondary effects, transferred from St. Catherine's overflow. He came in with a service dog. She paused. Kowalski told him the dog had to go to the waiting area. Nadine stopped pulling on her gloves. He told a veteran with PTSD that his service dog had to wait in the lobby. Kowalski said the animal policy. The animal policy covers pets, Paulette. I know that. Service animals under the Accessible Canada Act are not subject to. I know that, Nadine. Paulette lowered her voice, which meant someone important was nearby or she was embarrassed on behalf of the unit. Kowalski has already called Gareth. Gareth was the evening administrator. He wore short-sleeved dress shirts in February and had a framed photo of himself golfing behind his desk. Gareth's position is that the dog presents a liability issue and that Fehr needs to demonstrate certification documentation before. He's in a behavioral health unit in crisis and they want him to produce paperwork. Paulette looked at the ceiling. It was a very specific look. It meant, yes, I agree with you. I cannot say so out loud. Please fix this. Nadine finished pulling on her gloves and walked to room 14. She knocked twice. Firm, not tentative, the way you knock when you want someone to know you're not afraid of what's on the other side. She opened the door to about 45 degrees and stopped there, visible but not entering, which was something her clinical instructor at the University of Ottawa had drilled into her a decade ago. Always let a patient in behavioral crisis know you are there before you are close. Warrant Officer Fehr. My name is Fournier. I'm your nurse for the night shift. The room was dim. The overhead light was off, and the only illumination came from the strip of light under the bathroom door and the faint ambient glow of the parking lot through the half-closed blinds. She could see him clearly enough. He was sitting upright in the hospital bed, still in his street clothes, dark cargo pants, a gray thermal, boots that he had not taken off. He was perhaps 50, or he had lived in a way that made him look it, with a jaw like a shelf and eyes that moved to her the instant she spoke and stayed there without blinking. Sable was beside the bed. The growling had stopped. The dog was watching Nadine with the focused, almost bureaucratic attention of an animal that was deciding something. Fehr, the man said. His voice was flat, not hostile, just information. I'm not here about the dog, Nadine said. I'm here because you came in to emerge 6 hours ago, and nobody has done your admission assessment, and that's not acceptable. I'd like to do it now, if you're willing. A long pause. Kowalski, said the dog. Kowalski is not on my team, and he was wrong. She said it simply, without heat, the way you state something that is simply true. Sable stays. Another pause. She watched his hands, which were on his thighs, which were very still. She had learned a long time ago that stillness wasn't calm. It was often the opposite. It was the containment of something that had nowhere to go. "You know her name," he said. "It was in your intake notes." She nodded at the chart in her hand. "Belgian Millenora, 4 years old, trained by Carefor. You've had her 2 years. She paused. "She's good. She hasn't barked once." Something shifted in his face. Not softness, exactly. More like the loosening of something that had been held very tight. "She doesn't bark," he said. "She was trained not to. She just positions herself." Nadine looked at Sable. The dog had, at some point in the last 30 seconds, sat down. She was still watching the door, but the line of her body had changed. Less coil, more anchor. "Can I come in?" Nadine asks. He didn't say yes, but he moved his hand slightly, palm up, which she took as the answer it was. The admission assessment took 40 minutes, which was 20 minutes longer than the standard, and worth every one of them. Daniel Fehr had done 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Latvia. He had been a warrant officer in the Royal Canadian Engineers. The kind of soldier Nadine understood from what he didn't say as much as what he did, who was put in charge of making impossible things possible under conditions that were trying to kill him. He'd been medically released 14 months ago. He lived alone in a 1-bedroom in Kanata. His daughter called twice a week. He had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours since the release. He told her this in pieces, between long silences, looking mostly at the wall or at Sable rather than at her. She wrote notes and didn't push and didn't do the thing she'd watched too many well-meaning residents do, which was lean forward and nod with too much urgency and make the patient feel like their pain was content to be consumed rather than witnessed. When she asked him what had happened today, what had brought him in, he was quiet for a long time. "I was at the grocery store," he finally said. "On Hazeldian, middle of the afternoon. A Tuesday, nothing. It wasn't anything. Someone dropped something in the next aisle, like a jar or a tin, something metal on tile. And I was on the floor. I couldn't." He stopped. "Sable found me. She was trained for that. She lay across my legs until I was back." He looked at his hands. "I called my daughter. She called 911. I didn't want to come here." "I know," Nadine said. "They wanted to take Sable in the ambulance. I wouldn't get in if she couldn't come." "Of course." "And then when we got here?" "I know," she said again. And this time there was something in her voice that made him stop and look at her directly for the first time. She met his eyes. "What happened when you arrived was wrong. Sable was a certified psychiatric service dog, and she is legally entitled to be with you in any healthcare setting in this country. That should have been the first thing anyone told you. Instead—" She paused, choosing the next word carefully. "Instead, someone made a very bad call, and I'm sorry for it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're apologizing on behalf of the hospital. I'm apologizing on behalf of anyone who made this harder than it needed to be." He said nothing, but something in the line of his shoulders, that geological stillness, shifted again, fractionally, like a fault line releasing pressure it had been holding for years. Sable put her head on his knee. Nadine was at the nursing station writing her notes at 2200 when Gareth came down the hall with Kowalski behind him. Gareth was the kind of administrator who led with his chin and arrived with his conclusions already drawn. "Fournier," he said, in the tone of someone who considered first names to be informal warnings. "I understand you overruled the animal restriction on room 14. She didn't look up from the chart immediately. She finished the sentence she was writing. "Patient demonstrates appropriate insight into episode, cooperative with assessment, vitals stable." And then she looked up. "Warrant Officer Fehr's service dog is a certified psychiatric assistance animal registered under federal accessibility legislation," she said. "Separating him from the dog would not only be a rights violation, it would be clinically contraindicated." His anxiety indicators were measurably lower within 15 minutes of the dog remaining in the room. Gareth clasped his hands in front of him, which was what he did when he was building to a reprimand. "That's not really the point, is it? The point is the liability. The liability runs the other direction, actually." She kept her voice level. If we had forcibly removed a certified service animal from a patient with PTSD experiencing a mental health crisis, and if that patient had experienced a deterioration in his condition as a result, the hospital's exposure would be considerably greater than whatever concern we have about Sable being in a patient room. Kowalski made a sound. The patient's concern doesn't override. The legislation overrides it, Nadine said. The Accessible Canada Act, Section 47. I can pull the text if that would help. There was a silence. Gareth's chin was very still. The dog stays, she said, and with respect, I'd like to finish my notes. She turned back to the chart. She heard them leave. She heard Kowalski say something under his breath as they went. She wrote the next line of her notes. Service animal present and appropriate. Reduction in observable distress markers following animal's continued presence confirmed by patient affect and vital sign comparison. And she made sure the timestamp was recorded correctly, because she had learned, over 6 years, that timestamps matter. She looked in on Fehr at 2300. He was asleep, which surprised her. She hadn't expected it. His chest rose and fell in the slow rhythm of actual rest, not the shallow half-sleep of someone enduring a night in a hospital bed. Sable was curled at his feet. The dog opened one eye when Nadine stood in the doorway, regarded her with a calm assessment of someone who had decided a long time ago whether to trust her, and then closed it again. Nadine pulled the door quietly shut. At 2 a.m, Paulette appeared beside her with 2 mugs of tea, the good kind, from the box Paulette kept locked in her desk, and sat down without saying anything for a moment. Gareth filed the performance note, Paulette said finally. I know. He's saying you overrode his administrative decision without authorization. I applied the law. Nadine wrapped her hands around the mug. He made a call that contradicted federal legislation and clinical best practice. I corrected it. If he wants to have that conversation with the chief of nursing, I'm comfortable with that. Paulette looked at her for a moment. Are you actually comfortable with that, or are you saying you are? Nadine thought about it. Both, she said, 50-50. Paulette almost smiled. Fehr's daughter called the floor at midnight, asking about him. What did you tell her? That he was resting and that his nurse had made sure he was settled. Paulette paused. She cried a little. She said it was the first time in 14 months she wasn't scared when she hung up a phone call about him. Nadine looked at her tea. Okay, she said quietly. More like 60-40 then. The morning brought Dr. Anand Chaudhry, the attending psychiatrist, who reviewed Fehr's file at 7 and came to the nursing station with a specific expression of someone who had spotted something in a chart that they wished they hadn't. Fournier. He sat down across from her. He was a careful man, deliberate in the way that very good clinicians tend to be. He never spoke quickly, because he had learned that most errors are made in haste. Walk me through last evening. She did. All of it. The admission without assessment, the dog, Kowalski's decision, the legislation, Gareth's response, the performance note. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The performance note, he said. Do you know what Gareth's stated concern was? That I overrode an administrative decision. His specific wording was that you created a unilateral exception to hospital safety protocol without authorization from appropriate management. He paused. I want to point out that no safety protocol at this institution covers certified service animals because they're not covered by the animal policy, because they are not, under the law, subject to it. Yes, she said. So the protocol he's claiming you violated doesn't exist. That's correct. He exhaled slowly. You documented everything. Time-stamped. He nodded, with the expression of someone who had worked in hospitals long enough to understand that timestamps were a form of self-defense. I'm going to speak with the chief of nursing this morning and with risk management. He stood. What you did last night was appropriate, both clinically and legally. I want that on the record. Thank you, Dr. Chaudhry. Don't thank me. Just keep documenting. She went in to see Fehr before her shift ended at 7:30. He was awake, sitting in the chair beside the window rather than the bed, which was itself a kind of progress. He had removed his boots at some point during the night. Sable was beside him, her chin on his knee, watching the door until Nadine knocked, and then relaxing with a small, satisfied movement that was almost businesslike, as if the dog were confirming, yes, this one is fine. You slept, Nadine said. First time in a while. He looked at his hands. I don't usually sleep in hospitals. I know. She stood near the door, not approaching, giving him the space she learned he needed. Dr. Chaudhary will come by at 8. He's the attending. He's good. He does a lot of work with veterans. He'll talk to you about a care plan. Fehr nodded slowly. He was still looking at his hands. Then he looked up at her, and she saw in his face something that was very difficult to look at directly. Not because it was ugly, but because it was the opposite. It was unguarded. That thing last night, he said, with the administrator. That's resolved. You didn't back down. She thought about how to answer that. No, she said. I didn't. Why not? She considered the real answer, which was layered and complicated and involved a clinical ethics workshop she'd taken in her 3rd year and a conversation she'd had with her own father, who had been a paramedic for 30 years and who had told her once that the most dangerous thing in any healthcare system was the assumption that authority and correctness were the same thing. She considered all of that, and then she gave him the simpler version, which was also the true one. Because it was the right thing to do, she said, and because it wasn't hard, actually. Sable is a working dog with federal recognition, and you are a patient in crisis. There was only one correct answer. I just had to say it out loud. He was quiet. Sable made a low sound, not the growling from before, something different, something that, if it had come from a person, Nadine might have called a sigh. Warrant Officer, she said. He looked at her. You're going to be okay. She said it the way she had learned to say things that mattered, which was simply, without flourish, without the hesitation that turns a statement into a plea. It's going to take a while, and it's going to be hard, and Dr. Chaudhary is going to want to talk about options that might make you uncomfortable, but you slept last night, and Sable is here, and your daughter called. Something moved across his face. He pressed his lips together for a moment and looked out the window, and when he looked back, his eyes were clear and steady and very tired in the way that comes not from despair, but from the long work of surviving. Thank you, Fournier, he said. The way he said it, last name, no title, the way soldiers spoke to each other, she understood it for what it was. 3 weeks later, she received a letter. Actual paper, in an envelope with a Kannada return address. Inside was a single page in careful, angular handwriting. Fournier. Chaudhary says I'm making progress, which I think means I'm doing the uncomfortable things. I'm sleeping better. Sable sends her regards. My daughter wanted me to write and tell you that she is, in her words, extremely grateful to whoever you are. I told her your name. She said she was going to nominate you for something. I told her you'd probably roll your eyes at that. She said that's how you know it's deserved. Fehr. Nadine read it twice at the nursing station, during a quiet moment between rounds. Then she tucked it into her jacket pocket, finished her tea, and went back to work. I keep thinking about the dog. Not the administrator, not the performance note, not even the letter that came 3 weeks later in an envelope with careful handwriting. I keep thinking about Sable, sitting down in the middle of a room that had been hostile to her for hours because something in the air had changed, because someone had walked in and told the truth quietly, and the dog, who had been trained to read a room better than most people ever learned to, felt it. There's something in that I haven't been able to shake. I've worked in healthcare long enough to know that institutions don't fail people all at once. It happens in small decisions. Someone decides a policy applies when it doesn't. Someone decides the paperwork matters more than the person holding it. Someone decides that the path of least resistance is also the path of least harm, and they are wrong about that in ways they never have to reckon with, because they leave the room before the consequences arrive. What happened to Fehr that evening wasn't one person's cruelty. It was a series of small abdications, each one reasonable sounding on its own, each one adding weight to a man who was already carrying more than most people will ever understand. I think about integrity a lot, not as an abstract value, but as something mechanical almost. Either you know what is right and you act on it, or you don't. There isn't much middle ground, even when it feels like there is. When I walked into room 14, I wasn't being brave. I was just doing the thing that was clearly correct, And the only reason it felt like courage was because someone ahead of me had already decided not to do it. That gap between knowing and doing is where people get hurt. Fehr had been hurt in that gap. He deserved better than to be hurt in it again, in a hospital, by people who were supposed to help him. And then there's the matter of actually knowing what you're doing. Caring about a patient isn't enough if you don't know the legislation, if you can't cite the section, if you can't stand in front of an administrator and be specific. Fehr needed someone who had done the reading. Sable needed someone who understood that her presence wasn't a comfort measure. It was a clinical intervention, measurable, documented, defensible. The knowledge I had in that moment wasn't incidental. It was years of accumulation. It was the difference between feeling like something was wrong and being able to say precisely what was wrong and why. What strikes me most, looking back, is how much Fehr had already survived by the time he got to our floor. 2 tours, a medical release, 14 months of trying to rebuild something that the military doesn't give you a manual for. He'd done all of that and still ended up on the floor of a grocery store in Kanata on a Tuesday afternoon with only Sable between him and the worst of it. He kept going anyway. He called his daughter. He got in the ambulance. He sat in that chair and answered my questions in the dark. That kind of persistence, quiet, unglamorous, not heroic in any cinematic sense, is the thing I find hardest to describe and most worth paying attention to. The letter sits in my jacket pocket still, actually. I moved it from my locker to my pocket at the start of a shift last week and forgot to move it back. I notice it sometimes, a small rectangle of weight against my ribs, and I think, this is why you document the timestamp. This is why you know the section number. This is why you knock twice and don't come in until you're invited. Sable sat down because something in the room told her it was safe. I think that's the whole thing, really. That's the whole job.